Over the next couple of weeks, we are going to delve more deeply into specific contexts and issues that are central to understanding conflict. This week, we will look at how group dynamics impact conflicts. There are any number of ways to begin to look at group dynamics. Understand how group roles and norms impact how conflicts emerge, escalate, and de-escalate. And as a way, when we think of ourselves as conflict theorists, to analyze and assess what's happening in group conflict. I'm going to make two assertions about groups and conflict. One is that humans need groups. We do a lot of our work in groups for really good reasons. It's efficient, it's effective. Sometimes we get better decision making, better thinking, better problem solving as part of a team. And at the same time, groups need conflict. When we think about how groups come together, we have this notion of forming, storming, norming, and performing. The idea is that as groups come together and form, there's going to be some negotiation and some conflict about what it means to be a group and how we're going to interact with one another. What are the rules that are going to guide our behaviors? This is storming. Out of those negotiations and maybe conflict comes norming, a process of saying and coming to some agreement about what our group interactions are going to look like. Once those are settled, we get around to performing, to doing the tasks or being the group that we've come together to be. Systems theory, I'm going to argue, is a really helpful way for us to think and get our heads around what's going on in group conflicts, and a way to look and assess group dynamics. Systems theory has been around as a way of looking at groups in the social sciences for a long time. It shifts us away from a more linear causality, from one input to one output, to looking more holistically at the dynamics that influence how group members behave with one another. And we're going to define a system as an interrelated, interdependent group, body, or institution. When we think about a system, it's useful to think about every system having three basic components: objects, boundaries, and an environment. In the case of groups, the objects are people, the members of the group. The boundaries are those lines that define who is in and who is out, who's a member and who is not a member. And the environment is the context in which the group exists. There are a number of qualities that help us think about and define what it means to think of a group as a system, are essential when we do analysis of a conflict in a group. The first is the notion of wholeness, that the group is more than the sum of individual members. If we want to understand group dynamics, we have to look beyond the individual personalities that members bring to the group. Let me use here the analogy of spaghetti sauce. When you make spaghetti sauce, you begin with a number of different items: tomatoes, garlic, onions, celery, maybe some herbs, oregano, thyme, garlic. You put it all in some water, you add some heat, you stir, you let it simmer. What emerges doesn't look anything like the individual items that you started with. There are no whole tomatoes. The garlic has disappeared. Often the onions and celery will have as well. Right? Spaghetti sauce becomes something different in texture and taste. When we think about doing analysis of conflict in groups, we need to try to get our heads around what is the whole. A second concept is the notion of interdependence, that any intervention that impacts one part of the system is going to affect the whole. Again, an image I might use is that of a bowl full of Jell-O. If you jiggle one bit, the whole thing jiggles and moves. There's absolutely no way that you can intervene or tweak or shift one part of the system without there being impact ripples that are going to affect the whole. Equifinality is the notion that causality is not linear, that there may be many paths to one outcome. There may be many causes that affect how we arrive at one outcome. Taken together, interdependence and equifinality remind us that when we're doing work with groups in conflict that it's hard to predict the outcomes of an intervention or a particular action. Open versus closed is a quality that refers to the kinds of borders and boundaries that groups have. Some groups are more open in their interaction with the environment, and others may have very little interaction with their environment. We think of open groups, open boundaries being much healthier, and closed boundaries often being dangerous. Input, throughput, output is the process by which we pay attention to the patterns of how a system works. Inputs are those things that enter into the group, and output is the ways in which they are converted into products or services. Groups often have hierarchies within them. Again, we'll think about the body perhaps as an analogy here. The body as a whole has many subsystems within it. The digestive system, the respiratory system, muscular systems, skeletal systems, all of them have to work together. All of them have their own inherent mechanisms and ways of functioning, and all of them have to interact with each other for the body as a whole to function effectively and efficiently. Again, when we think about conflict in groups, we want to pay attention to the integrity of the subsystems and to understand how those interact within themselves, but also then how they interact with other subsystems within the group, again, to form that whole. When we think about change in systems, one of the things we want to pay attention to is the notion that systems often strive for balance and self-preservation. In a sense, then, systems are often very resistant to change, and change may be perceived by a threat. Individuals in a system may welcome a desired change, but the system as a whole may be resistant. A principle we often call homeostasis, the desire to stay the same. And finally, when we think about change in a system, it's often helpful to think about first-order change and second-order change. First-order change occurs within a system. In some ways, it's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It often includes things like rewriting rules, job descriptions, perhaps firing the troublemaker, shifting one person for another in the group. It's change that essentially doesn't challenge the systems, it makes amendments to the charter. Second-order change tries to be more transformational. Second-order change tries to be more transformational. It tries to introduce a different game. It's about challenging the rules, about how the rules are made, kept, and recreated. Again, it's trying to take the wheelhouse away and reroute the Titanic, rather than just playing around with the deck chairs. If I can summarize the qualities of system thinking in relationship to a group, I want to pull out 3 key concepts. When we're doing assessment and analysis of conflict in groups, we have to look at the whole, not just the collection of individual behaviors. We're interested in how the parts of the system come together to create an organization, a pattern. If we think about the analogy of a car, right, we can't understand what a car is by looking at the wheels and the steering wheel and the windshield. We need to understand how all of the pieces, the engine, the body, all of those parts come together and work together to create the whole. And we want to identify patterns. What patterns are predictable? What function do the patterns serve? One of the things that I've asked you to do in applying this concept is to think about a group that you belong to and come up with a metaphor that describes your group. So I'm going to play around with a couple of metaphors just to help get you jump started down this process. I think that groups often like this metaphor because it implies diversity and it allows them to think about how they as individuals come together and work together as part of the whole. If you look at this first picture of a garden, this image of a garden might imply that we have a group that has a fairly clear and patterned set of ways of being with one another, that those are fairly ordered patterns, and that there might be kind of clear hierarchy among who can do what with whom, when, where, and how. Doesn't look like there's a lot of possibility or variability for moving outside of specific identified roles. It's also an image that suggests there's a garden planner and that there's people with very specific roles and talents around pruning. And what might happen to the weeds in this particular sense of a garden? The second picture again implies that there's a fairly distinct pattern. We can see it clearly, but a little bit perhaps less rigid, perhaps more organic within the subsystems, more flexibility and adaptability once you've been planted in your particular space to move and interact with those in your subsystem in however ways you might choose. Perhaps once the garden's been planted, much less need for ongoing gardening. Certainly not nearly as much pruning and shaping once the general pattern has been laid down, or once the initial planting has taken place. And finally, a third image, a field of flowers. Here, assessing the pattern might be a bit more difficult. It suggests a more organic process, perhaps, a freedom. Certainly a different kind of decision making about what counts as a flower, what counts as a weed. Perhaps more flexibility in terms of interaction and dynamics. If there are subsystems, they're not going to be as clearly identifiable. And yet the health of the meadow is going to be dependent on hardy plants that can survive the various conditions that might be present in this particular environment, and some kind of synergy and interaction in terms of the ability of the plants that are present here to sustain one another in this particular environment. A different metaphor altogether that we might play around with might be one of a farm, or again, some other kind of system with more clearly defined and different kinds of roles. Here we might see a greater diversity in terms of the kinds of roles that are established and the kinds of people that might be part of the group. Perhaps more of a hierarchy with a clear leader. Farms as existing in a context in which there are definitely different seasons, different kinds of labor required throughout the year in different ways. So the cycle might be a cycle in this kind of metaphor, a cycle or pattern in this kind of metaphor might be spread across time in a different kind of way. And finally, I'll introduce the three-ring circus. Again, a metaphor that implies very different skill sets among the members, perhaps a greater sense of autonomy between the different subsets than you might expect in the farm metaphor. Perhaps a greater ability for some subsets or members to leave the group. Perhaps some acts are needed or more central to the success of the circus than others. It might also imply more defined kinds of expertise. The lion tamer may not have much to say to the high wire acrobat teams about what counts as strength, what kinds of skills are needed to be successful in their work, and yet at the same time, you need the diversity of acts if you're going to be sustainable over time. It also implies a different role for the audience, and we might want to think about whether the audience is part of the environment or a different subset within the overall system that we see as the three-ring circus. Certainly without the audience, the circus doesn't have much meaning or purpose. As you think about your own metaphors for the groups that you're going to be writing about this week, I hope these metaphors give you a jumping off point for thinking creatively about how you might use a metaphor to think about the whole, what constitutes the organizational structures that define the group, and what patterns are important for understanding group dynamics. The next thing I want to just touch on briefly are selected principles that derive from systems theory that talk particularly about the nature of conflict within groups. And there are 6 principles that I want to touch on briefly. The first is that when we think about conflict in groups, conflicts occur in chain reactions. It's often really unproductive in conflict to think about trying to determine blame, but in groups this is particularly destructive. When you enter conflicts in groups, you're going to get lots of blame, pointing fingers, he started it, she started it, it's her fault, that sense of I'm only reacting, and someone else is really the cause of the conflict. But again, what we know is that systems operate with circular causality, and this suggests that assigning a beginning is much less important than looking for the sequence of patterns in the conflict process. If we want to do second order change and not first order change, it's really important that we identify the pattern. Systems also develop rules and norms for conflict. These are often very prescriptive rules about who should do what can be talked about, how conflict should be dealt with it, when it's appropriate, when it's not. They may be rules about who can get angry, who's supposed to speak, what kinds of topics can be talked about and what topics are off limits, and where and when and how conflicts can happen. Group members are often assigned specific roles. There are often very typical roles in groups: the leader, the follower, the blocker, the trickster, the joker, the mediator, the peacemaker, the troublemaker. Things that's important to keep in mind when we think about the roles that define group members is that it's the role that matters and not the person. One of the dynamics we often see in group conflicts is firing of the problematic person, or someone chooses to leave the group because they're so frustrated with what's happening. And what will happen is that the role will be assumed by somebody else. So again, often taking out a body doesn't do anything to change the conflict dynamics because that role is going to be assumed by somebody else. Conflicts happen because people play their parts, and one person cannot sustain an interaction. Everybody has to play their parts. This means that to some degree, conflicts can be changed by one person initiating a change or deciding to do something different within the structure. It also means that when this happens, there's going to be a lot of pushback from the group, pressuring that person to get back in line and to play their role. Triangles form to help keep balance in the system. When one person feels a lower level of power, the tendency is to bring in another person to bolster that position, to build an alliance. Again, a three-legged stool is often much more stable than a two-legged stool. Interlocking triangles can function over and over and in predictable ways. They can lead to destructive behavior and become quite toxic if they become particularly rigid, or if they become the source for greater polarization within the group. And finally, it's always really important to remember that conflicts serve a function in the system. Group members will tell you that they want the conflict to end, and yet they will continue to participate in perpetuating it, sometimes for decades. Sometimes this is because somebody in particular benefits from the conflict. It's a way to keep power or to feel powerful. And other times I think it's because simply the fear of the unknown, what would it be like if we didn't have this conflict, is greater than the distress that's caused by the conflict itself. Let me do a couple of more quick examples. Working with a church, this was the metaphor that they came up with to describe what their group was like in conflict. Someone would put up an idea, and it would be shot down. Arrows would come from different directions, and it was often impossible to identify the source of the criticism or the arrow. This metaphor was helpful, I think, for the group in that it helped to shift away what had at that point been a serious pattern of blame, particularly in this case it was a church and it was directed at the pastor. By naming the conflict pattern in this way, they began to be able to articulate the fact that anybody who put up a balloon had arrows shot at them, and that, again, it wasn't always the same people who were shooting the arrows, and it was very hard to identify often where those were coming from. It was a way for them to take some mutual responsibility for the ways in which they did decision making and offered criticism or support to one another, and to begin to rethink how they might create forums and conversations that would allow ideas to have a little bit fairer assessment than what they were getting within the current system. In an alternative group, this is a little bit hard to see in this picture, but these are some people in a lifeboat floating around on the water. And the arrows are representative of what they described as their oars. And what this group described as their way of interacting was that everybody had an oar in the water, and they all were paddling furiously all the time. If you can imagine what this looks like in a circular raft, what it meant was they were constantly going in circles. In opposition to the previous group, I would argue that in fact the problem of this group was that they were too nice. No one wanted to step out and say someone had a bad idea. No one wanted to say we're too tired. No one wanted to say maybe we all shouldn't have our oars in the water at the same time. Maybe we don't have enough resources to do everything that everybody wants all the time. Because no one was willing to step up and offer some leadership in this way, what they ended up doing was spinning in circles and becoming more and more exhausted. They needed to develop some conflict habits that would let them actually surface the conflict or disagreements, have it in healthy ways, and set some priorities and make some decisions about what they were going to do and what they weren't going to do. So, healthy conflict practices for groups. As you think about the readings for this week and as you think about the groups that you're involved in your own life, focus on system thinking. How do you understand the whole as well as the parts? It's important to think about causation in terms of complexity rather than linear unidirectional forces. Think about what it means to explore opportunities for first and second order change. How do you keep from just moving the deck chairs around to really steering the Titanic in a different direction? And make sure to think about how do you encourage communication both within the system and between the system and the environment. It's really critical to create openness and boundaries in order to create healthy system feedback loops. Looking forward to your metaphors about your groups and how these readings might help us think about healthy conflict and what that looks like in group life.